This is just a quick recap of our first introductory session when we looked at modernism. I just wanted to remind us of some of the things that I think we explored and hopefully some of the things that you learnt as well. So you can obviously access the PowerPoint on Blackboard, so please do look over it, especially with those technical issues that we had. I want you to be thinking about art from the 19th century and from the early 20th century. So looking at some of the changes that you can see in terms of representation. There's some music as well on the PowerPoint that you can play to give you a sense of some of the changing artistic expression and art forms that we were kind of coming up against, that we were as critics then defining as modernist. So to begin with, obviously we looked at an overview of the module, so familiarise yourself with the module handbook, and I'll bring in some printed copies for you so you've got those as well. It's really important that you know what the module is asking you to do, so do look over your learning outcomes and your assessment objectives in particular. Get the date in the diary for your first essay, the assignment which is worth 50%, which is going to look at modernism. Get that in right to begin with so you know what you're working towards. So we began to talk about some of the different definitions of modernism and how we might introduce these ideas and think about them in particular. So we looked in particular about if we were thinking about what kind of period modernism could be seen to occur in. We talked as well that it was an experimental movement focused, as we were looking in particular in Europe, across the arts. We are going to make some connections obviously with America. We already talked a little bit about Walt Whitman. We looked at T.S. Eliot as well and spoken quite a bit about Ezra Pound. So we were associating these writers, thinking about these writers as being avant-garde, as being experimental, as being innovative. And in order to explore those things, we need to think what they're reacting against. So we looked at Joyce and thought about this idea of scorch, to scorch what had come before, this kind of act of creative violence, if you like. We learned it was important to actually interrogate the term modernism, to think about where it came from. So from the Latin modo, meaning current. We talked about different writers, different movements, different individual writers using the term modern, using this idea of newness as being part of the way in which they were talking about themselves and talking about their work. But we also considered how modernism as an idea perhaps was something that was applied later by critics and particularly became popular in the 50s and 60s as a way of describing both individuals and also a series of movements that were coming out of this early part of the 20th century. We thought as well about some of the writers. A lot of modernist writers were writing diaries, were writing journals. That's very useful as a way into their thinking. Remember, it's a constructed voice. They know that they're writing for us as well as presenting us perhaps with some of their inner workings and feelings. But we looked at ideas of change, whether that was something that was hesitant, whether it's something that was sudden. So we used this term from Woolf, this idea of a plunge, and then thought about some of her own writing when she talks about something, this change being a moment, not sudden, not definite, and placing that change as happening around 1910. And looking at other writers such as D.H. Lawrence, who identified 1915 as being a key time. So do get into the reading, see the ways in which critics of modernism play with these ideas, think about when these moments, when these changes might have occurred and might have happened. We thought about the ways in which modernism, canonical modernism, has been thought about. We thought about the men of 1914 in particular and critiqued that and began to think about the ways in which we might think about modernisms, that we could think about queer modernism, that we could think about post-colonial modernism as well. So taking an idea, taking an established idea and also sort of seeing it from different angles. In terms of this module though, we talked about the writers that we were going to use as kind of a focaliser each week to consider, and these are key writers of the period, but I'd really encourage you to read widely. That's why you've got a reader there. It's to introduce you to other voices, other ideas, and you might find that you're very interested in some of these other writers, so I would really encourage you to explore those different voices. We talked about what these writers might have in common. So if we think about this tradition of the new, and I'm quite interested, I think, in thinking about these ideas of the individual, ideas of community, ideas of fragmentation as well. So thinking about how these writers are thinking about the self, how they're writing about the subject as well. So we'll talk more about that, and I'd like you to be reading around, thinking about some of the poetry and seeing ways in which you can connect these texts. You might find ways into them that we haven't thought of. So do share with us your thinking and your interest in these books. For the seminars, we set up this introduction to poetry. This was our kind of way in, if you like, and we identified that our poetry selection was a canonical selection. It was a reductive selection. We couldn't give you everything, and we looked at some of the various movements and identified a number of different movements. Sometimes of which were underpinned with modernist manifestos as well. So if you're interested in the manifesto, that would be something really to have a look at as well. And in the reader, we were kind of positioning two quite different kind of approaches to kind of modernist poetics. So we were thinking about imagism, this kind of idea of a snapshot, a direct treatment of the thing as being a reaction in particular to some of the more verbose, overblown perhaps Victorian verse that you might have come across previously, and then comparing that as well to T.S. Eliot. So looking at the wasteland, thinking about this complex, articulate, critical, creative, there's lots of C's in that sentence, really interesting voice for you to kind of explore. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look at both of those different angles, both of those different approaches in the reader as well. And we put a number of recordings on the Blackboard site for you, so hopefully be able to take advantage of those and listen more widely to what other critics have said about Eliot in particular.